My name is Chloe. I'm 35 years old and currently the governor of Michigan, but no one in my family ever thought I could amount to anything. 15 years ago, I was cast out by my own parents, publicly condemned by my sister during a family dinner, and thrown out of the house I once called home, all because of a video that was spread online without my knowledge. And today, right in the middle of a federal criminal trial in Boston, where my sister Emily Monroe is being prosecuted for evidence tampering, the entire courtroom suddenly fell silent as the judge frowned, glanced toward the back rows, and said aloud, "Is that Governor Monroe?" I stood up from a shadowed corner. No words, no gestures, just letting them see me. Emily's eyes froze. My mother clutched her chest, whispering something no one could make out. And my father? He just sat there, trying to confirm whether the woman they had once erased had truly returned armed with a kind of power they never imagined possible. Have you ever been treated like a disgrace by your own blood? Have you ever been discarded simply for not being the version they wanted? If this story resonates with you, leave a comment below. Hit like so I know you're listening. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can walk this journey to the end together. Because I'm going to tell you how a girl who once slept in a shelter walked into a courtroom as a governor. I used to think the worst pain came from a lover's betrayal. But I was wrong. The deepest wound is when your entire family looks you in the eye, calm, collected, and declares that you no longer deserve to be their child. I was 20 years old, a sophomore majoring in sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. I wasn't anything special, just a hard-working student who believed in first love. My boyfriend was Alex. He was a year older, from an average background, with a smile that could dissolve any argument. I had no idea what he was keeping behind my back until I broke up with him. Just 2 days later, the video surfaced. Less than a minute long, secretly recorded in a beachside motel during spring break. The footage was enough to destroy every ounce of dignity I had ever tried to protect. I didn't know how it got leaked. All I knew was that by the next morning, I had 12 missed calls, 8 texts, and 3 emails titled, "Chloe, is that really you?" I remember sitting frozen on the dorm bathroom floor for over an hour, hugging my knees, breathing in short gasps like my chest had collapsed. I didn't cry. I just felt cold. So cold that my skin turned pale even though it was spring outside. But colder than anything was the call from home. "Chloe," my sister's voice came through, firm and unshaking. "You need to come back. This afternoon. Everyone's waiting." Emily was never one for small talk. A brilliant law student at Harvard, she always spoke. Directly, efficiently sharp as a razor. I used to idolize her. Until that afternoon. I walked into the house like a stranger. No hugs. No one asking how I was. The whole family sat in the living room, my mother, Donna, nervously fingering her rosary beads. My father, Richard, in a full suit even though it was his day off, sipping from a half-empty glass of whiskey. Emily sat in the center white blouse, hair tied back like she was prepping for a hearing. "Do you know how fast this is spreading?" My father snapped before I could even sit down. "Your mother's board knows. The state bar knows. The old federal chairman even sent me the link." I wanted to say I didn't leak it, that I was filmed without my consent, that I was the victim. But they didn't want to hear it. Every sentence I tried to say was met with a frown, a disappointed glance, a dismissive shake of the head. "This isn't about whether you meant it," Emily said, her tone flat like she was reading a formal indictment. "It's about the fact that you've tarnished this family's name. Dad is a federal judge, Mom runs a women's foundation, and I'm on track to join the city's prosecutor's office. You've made us look like fools in the public eye." I turned to Mom, searching for even a flicker of compassion. But she only pressed her lips together and stared at her clasped hands. "I was set up," I said. "I didn't know he was filming. I never sent it to anyone. I swear." "The issue, Chloe," my dad cut in, "is that no one cares. They see you smiling, undressing, and they think you're the face of moral collapse. The Monroe name can't be attached to that." I stood up. "What exactly are you saying?" He calmly set his glass down on the table. As of today, you're no longer the daughter of Richard and Donna Monroe. All bank records, tuition support, and financial ties are severed. Your Monroe Foundation scholarship has been canceled. We can't afford to let you remain in our system as a liability, Chloe. Emily stood too, like she was backing him up. This isn't out of hate, it's for the family's protection. A necessary step. I looked at my mother. You really agree with this? She looked up at me for the first time since I entered the house. And in a whisper, she said, "You made a poor choice, and your father has no other option." I don't remember how I left. I just remember going back to my dorm, throwing some clothes, a worn notebook, and my laptop into a red backpack. Then I left. No goodbyes, no tears. I got on a bus heading west. No destination in mind. I just knew I couldn't stay in Philadelphia, not in a place where everyone looked at me like I was a stain on the silk sheet of a prestigious family. I didn't sleep during the overnight ride. I stared out the window as the streetlights blurred past like long, ghostly streaks. I didn't know where I was going, what I would do, or whether anyone in this world would ever see me as a person again. I used to think love could save me from loneliness, but I was wrong. Because when you lose your family, you don't just lose your support, you lose your identity. You start to wonder who you even are anymore. And if the people who gave you life don't believe you're a good person, then who else possibly could? I sat quietly on that creaky bus rolling through Ohio, clutching my backpack like it was all I had left. In my coat pocket, I found an old note one my mom had once tucked into my lunchbox back in 8th grade. It said, "Chloe, you're the sweetest thing God ever sent." I folded it, didn't cry. I just looked into the darkness outside and thought, if they can erase me from the family, then I have every right to create a new name for myself. A name that, years later, would make an entire courtroom fall silent. I arrived in Detroit on a cold gray morning in April, with nothing but one backpack of clothes, a torn notebook, and a phone with no service. The city didn't welcome me, but at least it didn't ask who I was. I spent my first 3 nights on the sofa of an old classmate named Rachel, the only one from our college group who still replied to my texts. She was kind, but had 2 small kids and a husband out of work. By night 4, I knew I couldn't keep being a burden. I thanked her with all the sincerity I had in my eyes, then stepped back onto the street with $18 in my wallet and no plan. For a week, I lived in the prayer room of a tiny church by the Rouge River. Each morning, I cleaned pews, scrubbed bathrooms, brewed coffee, and sat quietly while the pastor preached forgiveness. But peace like that never lasts. One chilly afternoon, an elderly nun came to me gently but firmly and handed me a slip of paper with an address. "Fort Street Women's Center," she said. "They have beds, warm meals, and don't ask too many questions." I left the church that night, my canvas shoes soaked and cold from the rain, and followed the directions to the shelter. It was an old building with peeling paint, but inside it was warm, lit by soft yellow lights. They gave me a bunk bed by the wall, a worn blanket that still smelled like soap, and a steaming bowl of beef stew. For the next 3 weeks, I lived alongside women who had nothing in common except for one thing. We'd all been left behind. Some had lost their children to the courts, some had broken spines from abusive husbands, and some simply had no home to return to. I didn't share much about myself. I told them my name was Chloe Gray. No last name. When they asked what I used to study, I just smiled. A bit of philosophy, a bit of sociology, nothing that helps when you've lost your place to sleep. They didn't laugh. They nodded, because they understood. That's how I lived until the 22nd day, when the shelter bulletin board posted a little flyer: City Hall hiring temporary janitorial staff, hourly pay, starts next week. I went to the interview the next morning. A silver-haired woman named Sharon asked me 3 questions. "Are you willing to work night shifts? Any issues with cleaning chemicals? And can you stay silent while working in government offices?" I answered yes, no, and yes. And just like that, I was hired. City Hall was in a small suburb west of Detroit called Bramblewood. Quiet, forgotten. Barely a dot on the map, but it still had a three-story municipal building with dusty red carpets and an elevator that groaned every time it moved. My job was to mop the hallways, clean restrooms, change trash bags in the meeting rooms, and most importantly, never be remembered. I usually started at 8 p.m. and finished at 3 in the morning. During short breaks, I'd sit behind the staircase, eat a cold sandwich, and scribble a few lines in my notebook in handwriting so tiny it looked like ants on the page. One Thursday night, around 2 a.m., I was emptying the trash on the second floor when I heard voices arguing down the hall. A man's voice, loud, English laced with Spanish, a woman sobbing, pleading. I slowed down, rubber gloves squeaking as I tightened my grip. Immigration officers. I recognized the uniform, the tone. A male officer was forcing a woman to sign a stack of paperwork. Next to her, a little girl, maybe 6, stood shivering in a thin jacket. "This is a finalized deportation order," the man said loudly. "Sign this, and you can collect your belongings." The woman didn't understand. Or maybe she did, but was too scared to react. I wasn't supposed to interfere, but my feet moved forward anyway. "Hold on," I said, my voice steady. "You can't force her to sign without a certified interpreter. Who are you?" He snapped, spinning around. "Legal assistant," I lied. My heart pounded. But I didn't step back. I just checked. ICE's system hasn't updated recent files. The documents you're using might already be invalid. If you're unsure, I suggest you hold off until the center's attorney can review the case. I said it firmly, with the tone I'd heard my sister use 100 times during mock trial tournaments in college. Maybe he recognized it, or maybe he just didn't want trouble. He scowled, then shoved the papers back into his folder. "I'll return with updated orders," he muttered, and left. The woman collapsed into a chair. The little girl ran into her arms. I said only, "Go, as soon as it's daylight. Call someone for help." Then I turned and walked away. I didn't wait for a thank you. I thought that was the end of it. But 3 days later, I was summoned to the admin office. She was sitting there, the woman in a gray fur coat, gold-rimmed glasses, her nameplate reading, Martha Langston. I'd heard of her. Former civil rights attorney, once led a landmark abuse case in this state. "You're not a legal assistant," she said calmly. I didn't deny it. I just nodded. "Then how did you know how to speak like someone who studied law?" I didn't answer. She slid a folder toward me. "I've been watching you for weeks. The way you walk, the way you avoid cameras. You're not a nobody. You're just hiding." I bit my lip, ready to leave. She raised her hand. "Don't be afraid. I'm not here to threaten. I'm here to ask, do you want a chance? A real one. No more lies, no more hiding." I couldn't speak. "Someone once gave me a chance. Now I want to give that back," she continued. "I have an internship position. Paperwork, translation, some preliminary reporting. Not great pay, but enough to start." I looked at her, unsure if I should thank her, doubt her, or run out of that room. She just smiled, gently, and said, "I see something you haven't dared look at in the mirror, and I'll wait for you until you're ready to face it." I took the folder, walked out, and didn't look back. But that night, for the first time in months, I sat down and wrote a full name on paper. Chloe Monroe Gray. A name not quite whole, but enough to begin again. I started again in a small classroom with 18 students, inside a prefab building at Wayne County Community College. Outside the window was a messy parking lot, a few old cars dusted with dry snow, and the sound of distant train whistles. Every morning, I entered class with a notebook, and no one knew I had once carried the Monroe name. Martha once said something I'll never forget. "To survive in this world, Chloe, sometimes you have to let people believe you're forgettable. That's not weakness. That's strategy." I took it to heart. I used the name Chloe Monroe Gray for all documents. No one questioned it. A hyphenated last name like thousands of others in this country. I avoided cameras, skipped extracurriculars, declined group events. I just studied and worked. During the day, I managed the school library logging checkouts, sorting returns. At night, I worked at a print shop, where I learned to edit documents, format reports, and type so fast that the manager once asked if I'd worked at a law firm. I didn't confirm. 2 years later, I graduated at the top of my class. No one attended my ceremony, but Martha was there. She stood at a distance, didn't call my name, just gave a single nod like a soft period ending a long, hard-fought sentence. She said, "It's time you take another step." She recommended me to the University of Michigan for their master's program in public policy. I was accepted largely thanks to a letter of recommendation she wrote by hand, one I never got to read. I doubt it said I once scrubbed toilets in Bramblewood, but I'm sure it mentioned the night I stood between a mother and a deportation order issued in a language she couldn't even understand. At Michigan, I stayed, small again. I never mentioned the past, never said I had a father who was a federal judge or a sister who was a celebrated prosecutor. Never brought up the 3-story house in Rittenhouse where I'd eaten my last dinner as one of them. I studied policy like it was the only way to survive. I read about civil rights, community intervention programs, American legal history, and family justice models. I sat in the front row, asked sharp questions, but never drew attention. One professor once said, "Miss Gray doesn't speak often, but when she does, people should listen." That was also when I founded Second Window. The name came to me in a dream where I was standing at the old Monroe house. The front door was locked, like it had been the last time I left. But in the dream, I didn't try to force it open. I walked around back and found a window that was still open. To me, Second Window was the idea of an alternate exit for those who were hurt by their own families. Not everyone gets the chance to be loved again by those who once abandoned them, but everyone deserves another door. I built the organization with what I had: drafting documents, writing grant applications, creating a basic website with a free template, filing for state registration. I typed the very first words for the homepage myself. We don't ask where you've come from. We only ask what you need to keep going. At first, it was just me. Then came Ellie, a sociology student disowned by her father for living as her true gender. Then Marcus, a veteran who lost his home in a property dispute with his own brother. Every person I worked with, I kept my real identity hidden, not out of fear, but because I wanted them to see the work, not the name Monroe that once taught me everything had to be tied to legacy. Once, in a meeting with a representative from a large nonprofit considering a grant, a middle-aged woman named Leslie asked, "Have you experienced what these people you help I go through?" I looked her straight in the eye and replied, "I don't tell my story in boardrooms, but I don't do this out of pity. I do it because I've lived it." She didn't ask anything else. After 6 months, Second Window helped more than 30 people find temporary housing, get basic legal support, and connect with mental health services. We took no funding from religious institutions and never made aid conditional on moral values or lifestyle choices. I wrote the first impact report myself, 8 pages, clean and concise, and sent it out to a small circle of organizations. Within 2 weeks, 3 responded. One invited me to present at a conference in Ann Arbor. I declined. I nominated Ellie instead. She did so well that she got hired full-time at a larger organization in Chicago. I was proud, but I stayed behind. I still lived in a small apartment near the bus stop, still walked to the office, still shopped at the discount store down the block. And every night, before bed, I still wrote a few lines in the same old notebook where my name was penciled in faint gray, Chloe Gray. I never thought I was building something big. I just thought if I could be the first to open that second window, then someone else could be the second, the third. Everyone at the organization thought I was just a quiet woman with a quiet past. They didn't know I once sat in a marble-floored living room, had dinners with people who could call senators by their first name, but I wasn't ready for them to know. Because deep down, I was still afraid not of being recognized, but of being tied again to that old name. Afraid it would steal the real reason I started, to build something that didn't need a family name to be worth something. I've never spoken out under my real name. But every action I've taken, every person I've helped, Every pain I've recorded was a whisper sent back to the place I was pushed from, that I'm still here, and I've carved out my own way forward. I filed my candidacy for Lansing City Council on a cold gray morning in early fall. No one saw me off, no well wishes. The registration office was nearly empty, with one woman behind the counter asking, "Chloe Monroe Gray, you sure?" I nodded. I don't do loud, but I know what needs to be done. My campaign had no street banners, no flashy slogans. I didn't take photos with puppies or shake hands at farmers markets. I printed exactly one type of flyer, plain white, black text, no photo, no biography. Just 3 clear points: affordable housing, budget transparency, and legal assistance for families facing domestic violence. I knew who I was, and I didn't need to shout to be heard. People called my campaign too quiet, not compelling, lacking humanity. One local station labeled me the ghost who writes laws because I refused interviews, had no personal social media, and never appeared at public mixers. I didn't argue. I just kept mailing policy briefs to every resident, each one with a landline number they could call, where I answered myself. The week before the election, I got a call from a man named Howard, living in a low-income neighborhood on the south side of the city. He sounded breathless, slow, his voice rough with cigarettes. "Miss Monroe Gray, I don't know who you are, but they're trying to seize my house over 3 months of unpaid property tax. I don't need promises. I need someone who knows the law and can speak for me. Can you?" I didn't promise anything. I just sent him a petition for stay, along with the link to the state's free legal aid. A month later, he kept his house. And he became the first one to stand up at the flea market, hold up my flyer, and say loud, "She ain't got no picture, but she gets things done." I won by 31 votes. I joined the Lansing City Council like someone no one noticed. But week after week, they started to. I never missed a meeting. I read the entire budget down to every figure. I asked the questions no one liked answering. I demanded the list of favored contractors be published. And I pushed for a change in the emergency response system for women whose addresses had been redacted due to domestic violence. "You're making enemies who don't want to be touched," a senior councilman whispered to me in the elevator. I smiled slightly. They haven't seen how far I can reach. 3 years later, I ran for the Michigan State Senate. This time, people noticed. A white woman, background unknown, no family photos, no traditional bio, still no social media. They called me a political ghost. Some suspected I had a criminal record. Others said I was a puppet for underground donors. I didn't respond. I just went to every little town no one bothered to debate in. I took long-haul buses, carried 2 outfits and a color-coded printout of the state budget. At each stop, I held kitchen talks, literally sitting in people's homes, chatting over old coffee pots, asking what they needed, writing it all down. When the election results came out, I didn't celebrate. I went back to the second window office and helped Ellie sort paperwork. She looked at me and said softly, "I think people are going to start asking who you really are." I smiled. They'll just see the work. They don't need to see me. But then something happened that I never expected. At 33, the governor was placed under federal investigation for misusing public funds for private events. A federal probe opened. He was suspended from office. And under state law, the lieutenant governor steps in. I was that lieutenant governor. I became the acting governor of Michigan, the youngest ever, and the most unknown. "Would you like to hold an introductory press conference?" the chief of staff asked. I shook my head. I want the first task to be freezing all undispersed budgets and reviewing public service contracts from the last 6 months. "At the very least, we need an official portrait for the Capitol," he said. I nodded. "Pick one where you can't see my face. From the back is fine." A week later, a local paper ran the headline, "The Faceless Governor." Quiet but not invisible. I said nothing. I just sent my first memo to every county office. From now on, every legislative draft must include an impact report on vulnerable populations, especially dependent children and elderly individuals. I knew many people wouldn't like me, but I didn't need to be liked. I only needed to be trusted. Once, at a regional leadership meeting, an older woman stood up in the room and said, "I've never seen anyone go this far without ever boasting about who they are." I only smiled and replied, "Some people aren't born to be seen. They are born to see others." And that's how I began my term. No slogans, no celebration. Just a woman, with a name that had once been struck out, now rewriting it through line items in budgets, and each new clause in law. I got a call one winter morning while I was preparing for a budget hearing at the Capitol. Outside, light snow dusted the stone railings like powdered sugar. I was still wearing my gray wool coat and holding a cup of coffee I hadn't had time to drink when the phone rang. An unfamiliar number, no area code. I almost didn't answer, but something in the palm of my hand made my thumb swipe the screen. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then a woman's voice came through, small, hoarse, and shaking. "Is this Miss Gray?" "I'm listening." I'm sorry to call at this hour. I don't know who else to call. But I saw your name on an old list. They told me you once helped a woman named Alma avoid deportation in Bramblewood, more than 7 years ago." I went quiet. That name brought up an underground current rushing to the surface. Alma, the woman who had held her child and cried when I stopped an immigration officer from handing her the wrong paperwork to sign. "I'm her sister," the caller continued. "Alma passed away. But I kept all the letters, the documents. In them is your case file. Recently, a volunteer attorney reviewed it. They found the lead prosecutor listed on the case was Emily Monroe." I didn't answer. The voice on the line continued, slower and clearer. "They say evidence was edited, files don't match, and the person in charge ordered the original witness statements withdrawn. The attorney says that if more people come forward, this could become a serious investigation." They asked me if I knew anyone who had ever stood up to her. My coffee went cold in my hand. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I want to know if it were you. What would you do, knowing your sister caused dozens of people to be separated from their children, from their homes, just to win a case?" I don't know how I sat down in the leather chair at the end of the hallway. My heart slowed, not from surprise, but because deep down I had always known. Emily is meticulous, brilliant, and ambitious to an icy degree. When we were children, I watched her mark off scholarship applications day by day, plan every exam, plot each promotion. Each victory was a brick in the tower of her reputation. But I also remember the look in her eyes the one time I scored higher than her 10th grade sociology. It wasn't the look of a sister. It was the look of a competitor who couldn't accept losing. I used to wonder whether that spring break video was spread only by my ex. I never had proof, only vague suspicions. The sidelong glances. Emily's unusual coldness the night of the family meeting that forced me out. I hung up after promising the caller I would have my representative follow up. But I didn't hand it to anyone. I researched it myself. Within 3 days, I reviewed every immigration case where Emily Monroe's name appeared. One Honduran woman was deported after the evidence about her asylum journey had been omitted from the file. No defense attorney. No certified interpreter. Just a short summary and a deportation order. And that was only one of 19 similar cases. Emily's name turned up in 13 cases. In each, someone lost a chance, had their voice silenced or vanished from the system with no explanation. The press started digging. An investigative reporter at the New Beacon published a series, "The Court That Stayed Silent," a dossier on how federal prosecutors won immigration cases at any cost. Emily Monroe's name appeared in the headlines not as Boston's exemplary female prosecutor, but as someone linked to signs of evidence manipulation. Local television carried panel discussions. The host asked, "Is it the pressure to produce convictions that pushes prosecutors beyond ethical boundaries?" A guest replied, "This is not just an ethical issue, it's a human rights violation." I didn't speak publicly, but a week later I received a confidential report from one of my advisors at the State Department of Justice. It detailed that Emily Monroe was under an internal investigation by the Federal Audit Office after a whistleblower filed a complaint alleging forced edits to witness testimonies and the removal of original file information. The whistleblower's name was concealed, but I knew who it was. The voice from that phone call echoed in my head every night. I looked at the name Emily Monroe on the document as if I were staring at a portrait of the past. My sister. The one who led the intervention that made me leave home that year. The one who stood before our parents and read a list of my supposed faults like a formal indictment. The one who never once turned back to look. Now she stood at risk of losing everything, not because of me, but because of what she, or herself, had done. But what troubled me most was not that she was being investigated. It was why I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel vindicated. I only felt empty. Maybe because I knew the greatest loss isn't reputation or power. It's that a person who once called herself my sister had become someone I could no longer recognize. I flew to Boston on the first flight of the day, without an aide, without security, with no announcements. Exactly how I wanted it. I carried nothing but a small brown purse, a few unread documents, and a ticket for a seat in the back of the courtroom. The city appeared cold and wet like an old memory. Cobblestone streets, rows of red brick buildings, the salty smell from the harbor in the wind. I pulled my knit cap low and my light gray coat tight as I passed through the West Federal Courthouse gates. I'd been here no fewer than 10 times as a student, but never in a role like this. I appeared on the public attendees list as Chloe M. Gray. No, one took notice. I walked straight into courtroom 4D and sat in the last row on the left, against the wall. From there, I could watch everything without being noticed. Emily sat up front, hands folded on the table, wearing a tailored pale pink blazer, her hair knotted high and flawless. Papers still called her the steel wall of federal justice. But today, I saw tiny cracks in that wall around her eyes, at the knuckles where she clenched her hands. My mother sat a seat over. Her hair was grayer than I remembered. She wore a long navy coat, her rosary still in hand, quietly turning the beads. My father sat upright like a statue, expressionless, eyes fixed on the witness stand. I didn't expect them to recognize me right away. I didn't even know if I wanted them to. What I hadn't anticipated was Judge Tucker. When she entered, I recognized her powerful stride and the familiar black frames of her glasses. I'd met her at a national conference on justice reform where she'd spoken about the role of humanity in the enforcement of law. We'd exchanged a brief word in the green room, sharp, not arrogant. And today, with just a glance across the gallery, her eyes stopped. I could tell the light in the courtroom wasn't ideal. I was seated tucked behind two men in suits, but I could clearly see the change on her face when her eyes landed on me. She blinked, leaned slightly forward as if to be sure she wasn't mistaken. Then, instead of keeping silent as is customary, she blurted out, "Governor Monroe?" There was a silence like a nail being driven in. I heard a pen drop, a chair creak, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Every gaze in the room snapped to a single point where I was sitting. I did not stand. I did not nod. I did not smile. I simply sat still. Emily turned around. Her face went ashen as though she had seen a ghost. The lips that always controlled expression now trembled, betraying her. My mother put a hand to her chest. Her lips moved in something I couldn't quite hear. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a question. My father leaned forward, eyes narrowed, trying to distinguish between an apparition and an undeniable fact. I remained seated, my eyes refusing to look away. Not as a challenge, merely to be present. Presence was the strongest reply I could give them. After 15 years of being erased from the family calendar, after hundreds of dinners they shared without mentioning my name, after Christmases with no cards, no greeting, I returned, not to exact revenge. I came so they could no longer pretend I had never existed. Judge Tucker blinked again, quickly regaining composure. She adjusted her glasses, tapped the gavel 3 times, and resumed court proceedings as if nothing had happened. But the atmosphere in the chamber had irrevocably shifted. Each time a witness took the stand, I watched their eyes flick toward the back of the room. Each time the prosecutor rose, Emily blinked more often than usual, as if trying to hold her focus and failing. And I sat there, watching it all. No notes, no whispers to anyone, no unnecessary movement. I had not come to intervene. I had come to witness. After more than 2 hours, the court went into recess. People stood. A young reporter seated near me pulled out a phone and typed rapidly. A camera lens swung in my direction, but a security officer blocked it in time. I rose slowly, pulled my collar higher, and walked toward the side door. No one stopped me. No one asked a word. But I knew no one would be able to call me a shadow again, and that those silent, unsettled looks was the clearest moment I had ever had. I did not need them to admit wrongdoing. I only needed them to see me, long enough, clearly enough, so I could not be forgotten. I left the courthouse at 3:12 p.m. Boston was still gray, but the wind no longer smelled of salt. It was sharp and biting, as if winter had truly arrived. I crossed the street, walked, slowly, and did not look back. Because I didn't need to. After 15 years of detours, I had stepped into the place that once erased me, and sat down under the full weight of the existence I had reclaimed. No permission required, no calling needed, just timing. I know the story broke on a Saturday night. My communications director's phone started ringing nonstop early Sunday morning while I was steeping ginger tea and reviewing a rural emergency support reform proposal. She walked into my office, pale-faced. "The video's been reposted," she said, placing her tablet on my desk. On the screen was a blog with a red headline, "The Past You Can't Deny, the Michigan Governor's Scandal Video." Below it was the same grainy, secretly recorded clip that had been buried in the digital sand for more than a decade. This time, it was accompanied by a series of security camera stills, me leaving that shelter years ago with a red backpack, a thin jacket, and hair pulled into a bun, because I didn't have good shampoo. Another image showed the library card I once used at community college, now presented as evidence that she isn't who we thought she was. I was silent for a moment. Then I picked up the tablet and watched the entire clip. Not because I needed to verify it, but because I wanted to see it one last time, like looking at an old wound to confirm that it no longer smarted. "It's spreading fast," the communications director whispered. "We can ask for a takedown, or put out a statement. Do you want me to draft something?" I set the tablet down and pushed it back toward her. "No, don't react." She hesitated. "They won't stop. Someone's already reached Mom. The press is saying your father, Richard Monroe, has begun looking into your financial records." I looked up at her and let a faint smile appear. "I know he will do that." "What do you want us to do?" "I'll hold a press conference. This afternoon." "No. Apologies. No explanations. No hiding." That afternoon, I stood on the steps of Michigan's Capitol building, a place I had once passed by as a night shift janitor. Now, beneath the lights and before dozens of camera lenses, I wore a simple white coat, my hair pulled low, and looked straight ahead. "Thank you for being here today," I began, steady. "My name is Chloe Monroe Gray, and if you just saw the video circulating, you may think you discovered something new about me. But those images are all I once was and where I began." I let the words sit for a few seconds. Camera shutters clicked, a few brows furrowed, waiting for me to deny, to disavow, or to bow. I did none of those things. In this life, some people use their power to rewrite the stories of others, to erase pain, and to slap labels on people as if the past were a sentence. But I am not a victim of my past. I am its witness. I walked through it not to forget, but to understand the value of truth more deeply. I fixed my gaze on the cluster of Boston reporters I knew had interviewed my mother that morning. I remembered that look hers every time I walked into a room, not considered proper. Now I looked back at them with a kind of repayment. I am here today to introduce proposed legislation, the Family Accountability Bill. A bill to protect public servants or witnesses who speak out from family members who weaponize past information to threaten, manipulate, or harm them. Abuse of power, even when it comes from within the family, is still abuse, and silence about it is no longer an option. A cold wind blew across the plaza, lifting my coat like a thin curtain. For a few seconds, the square was quiet. Then an applause started on the right. 2 claps became 3. The sound swelled, and soon the area in front of the Capitol echoed with hands. But I knew not everyone was clapping. Minutes after I left the podium, the first headlines appeared on major news. 2 sites. Chloe Monroe Gray answers her past with policy. Bold move or manipulation. Governor hits the heartstrings. Political ploy or truth. Shelter survivor turned lawmaker proposes family honor legislation. Credible or contrived? I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Because I understood that for some people, one moment of perceived weakness is enough to define you. But for others, the moment you dare to stand still and not back down is what makes them remember you forever. That evening, I returned to my apartment in Lansing, turned off all the lights, and sat by the window watching the street below. I saw a group of young people laughing on the sidewalk, cars streaking past, leaving trails of light, and the snow beginning to fall gently. My phone kept buzzing. A new text notification appeared from an unknown number. You should stop, Chloe. You're digging your own grave. No signature. But I knew. The message carried the same tone used by someone who used it to call me child. Except today, he didn't use that name. I locked the screen, pulled an old photo from between the pages of a book on my table. It was a picture of me at 14, standing between Emily and our parents at a high school scholarship ceremony. I no longer recognized the look in my own eyes in that photo. But I kept it not to remember them, but to remember how small I once was standing among them. That night, I opened my laptop and typed the first line of the draft amendment. Any abuse of privacy aimed at controlling the public behavior of a family member, even if not criminal, may be subject to civil liability if it causes demonstrable harm. I typed every word slowly and precisely, because I was no longer writing to defend myself. I was writing so people who had been like me would know they were not alone. I received an invitation to dinner one Tuesday morning, tucked into a stack of office mail, thick card, embossed ink, slanted handwriting like calligraphy. No signature, just the cold printed line. Dinner at home Friday, 7 p.m. Hope you'll come. I thought about tossing it, as I had with all the faded, scattered notes my family had left me over the years. But I didn't. I left the card on my desk for 3 days untouched. On Friday afternoon, looking in the mirror, I chose an ordinary outfit. An olive crew-neck sweater, soft pants, hair tied low. No power, no message, just me. I arrived at the old house in Philadelphia on time. The iron gate creaked as always, and the maple trees lining the path still shed leaves that used to carpet the walk every autumn. But I did not enter as a daughter. I entered as a guest. My mother opened the door. She wore a dark knit dress, the rosary still in her hand. Her eyes were slightly swollen. But her smile, it was the same, not exactly welcoming, more a habit. Behind her, my father stood erect as ever, his gaze appraising but not harsh. At the head of the dining table, Emily folded napkins, fingers trembling slightly, lips pressed tight as if ready to break. "Thank you for coming," my mother said softly as I crossed the threshold. I didn't reply. I only nodded. Dinner was laid out with care. Roast beef, French style, vegetables arranged like flowers, a bottle of old wine my father had kept since the year he won the big case. The room smelled of cinnamon and gravy. Candles burned slowly, casting a warm light over familiar faces. We sat. No one spoke for the first few minutes. The sound of spoons against plates marked each beat. I didn't eat much. I quietly cut small bites as if taking part in a ritual rather than a meal. Then Emily set down her knife. She wiped the corner of her mouth and looked up. Her eyes found me not with the coldness of before, not with pride, but with something very tired, very human. "Chloe," she said, voice thick. I know I was wrong. Not just wrong in my work. I was wrong to you. For a long time. I was silent, still staring into my glass. Emily continued. "Back then, I should have stood between you and them. I chose to stand with them. Not because I hated you, but because I thought if I sacrificed you, the rest would hold. Now I realize nothing remained. My mother placed her hand on the table and pulled an old, small envelope from her purse. She pushed it toward me. I wrote this, not to excuse myself, just things I didn't have the courage to say before. I glanced at the envelope. I did not open it. I did not need to. Then my father spoke, his voice even, sharp as if reading a verdict. We had great expectations for you, Chloe. But perhaps I was wrong not to see you writing your own life instead of living by the plan I set. I looked at him. The eyes were older, but still those of a man who found it hard to admit fault. And even in the gentleness of his words, I felt the control beneath. You've come very far, he added. And I have never said this, but I always thought you would do something. Even if the way you chose was unlike anyone else's. I set down my cutlery and sat up straighter, looking each of them in turn. If today I were still the municipal janitor, if I still lived in a shelter and carried an unknown name, would this dinner happen? No one answered. Emily bowed her head. My mother blinked repeatedly. My father tightened his hand but said nothing. I looked at the plate of untouched food in front of me. I didn't come to hear apologies, nor do I want praise. I still carry the Monroe name not to bring honor to anyone, but to prove the name you abandoned can still live, grow, and stand tall. Emily's voice broke. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I hoped you might, if possible, say a few words to the prosecution on my behalf. Not officially, not a pardon. Just some confirmation that I can be seen as a person again. I was stunned for a moment. You want me to vouch? For your character? I asked softly. Not to save me, Emily rushed to say, but to help me not entirely lose the chance to begin again. I stared at the candle, silent for a long while. Eventually I spoke. I once begged to be seen as a person again. I waited for someone to tell me I deserved to live with dignity. None of you did that. No one contradicted me. I rose, pushed my chair back gently, careful not to make a sound. This dinner may be the last one. I lived for 15 years without you. And I will continue to live not relying on anyone's pity, not even family. I walked to the door. My mother called after me, voice trembling. Chloe, please don't go like this. I turned and looked at her long and hard. I'm not leaving. I'm just no longer in the position of having to bow. Then I left, stepping out the threshold as I had at 20. But none of their things clung to me, no glances, no expectations, no burden. Just myself and my feet. Less than a week after that dinner, a string of anonymous emails began circulating in media inboxes. The governor's office and watchdog groups, no greeting, no signature, only the subject. Truth about Chloe Gray. Inside were attached PDF files and grainy photos of academic documents. A handwritten job application I'd once submitted at the Detroit Women's Center with the education line reading, Bachelor, University of Pennsylvania, in progress. I remember that application. I wrote it while curled up in the shelter room, under a yellowing light, my hands shaking from hunger. At that time I hadn't graduated, but I wrote it anyway, because I had been studying, because I had never given up, and because if I didn't write it that way, I wouldn't get the janitorial job, the job that helped me survive and led me to where I am today. The emails didn't stop there. Attached were accusations that I had forged credentials to enter public office. Another note claimed my admission file at the University of Michigan showed irregularities and may have been influenced by someone to bypass the admissions process. Nothing had been verified, but it was enough. The media erupted like dry grass catching flame. Governor fraud? Chloe Monroe Gray from the shelter to office by shortcut? Are we putting our trust in an illusion? The legal team urged me to issue an immediate denial and to submit copies of my academic records. My communications director suggested calling a special legal panel, even considering lawsuits against the outlets spreading the files. I did nothing for the first 2 days. I reread every email, every line of accusation, and sat alone by the office window, watching the city keep running as if no crisis existed. I knew this was the final strike from someone not unknown. Someone who knew what I had written, what I had miswritten, how my hand had trembled submitting a small application for a papal place in a cold world. And I also knew that if I chose to hide, everything I had built would be shaken not by wrongdoing but by silence. A special hearing was set at the Capitol, before a federal panel with civilian observers. The chamber was packed, cameras pointed at me from every angle. No one from my legal team spoke on my behalf. I requested to present myself. I stepped up to the lectern and placed a thin stack of papers before me, plain, unbound. "Members of the panel," I began, voice steady and clear. "I am not here to defend power. I am here to defend something else, the honesty I kept when I had nothing left to lose." I opened the file and read, line by line, the sworn statement I had written with my own hand, unedited, with no one vetting it. "My name is Chloe Monroe Gray. I was once homeless. I slept on church benches, borrowed an iron from the shelter to press a threadbare shirt I'd gotten from a charity shop. I washed dishes for hire in 3 small F5P diners to get by. I was harassed while cleaning for a city council office." I paused for a few seconds. No one moved. I continued. "I once misrepresented my education on an application at a shelter because I didn't know whether I would still be there the next day. But I never forged a degree. I never asked anyone to influence my acceptance. And I never thought my circumstances were a reason to abandon the truth." I looked straight at the front row, where one of the panel members, Linda Haskins, who had opposed me during a budget hearing, watched me with an unreadable expression. "You don't have to take my word for it. I have submitted copies of my full academic record, my diploma from Wayne County Community College, my master's degree from the University of Michigan, and a list of faculty advisors who can verify. I also request that the entire admissions file and review process be made public." I set my hand on the papers, light but firm. "I have nothing to hide. What I've carried for 15 years is not a secret, but the enforced silence of a world that prefers to hear those with privilege over those with truth." When I finished, I did not ask for sympathy. I merely bowed my head slightly and left the podium as I had left small community meetings years before, quietly, upright, without needing applause. 3 days later, the investigation's findings were announced. There was no evidence that I forged credentials. No irregularities were found in the files. That job application was confirmed as written while I was still studying, and in progress was a legally acceptable description at the time. I was cleared. Clean. But what stuck with me wasn't that verdict. It was an email from an anonymous sender with a simple address: richard.monroe@retiredjudiciary.org. Inside were exactly 7 words. "You owe no one an explanation." I read those words in silence. No reply. No save. But I knew it had come from the man who once told me I was no longer his daughter. I went to Washington on an early October morning, when the yellow leaves had started falling along the Potomac, and the mist still clung to the rooftops of the federal buildings. I traveled alone, no aide, no press team, no one to cart my suitcase or remind me of my speech time. I pulled my small suitcase through the hotel lobby like a woman attending an ordinary conference. But I knew this wasn't an ordinary conference. And I was no longer the woman who had left a Detroit shelter in torn shoes and a water-streaked photocopy of a resume. The National Conference on Family Policy took place in the main hall of the Federal Community Center, where 300 delegates from different states and independent organizations gathered to discuss the role of family in a changing society. In the audience were faces that had once doubted me, even attacked me, but today they could no longer ignore my presence. I stepped onto the stage at 8:30, greeted by polite but not exuberant applause. A small microphone was clipped to my charcoal vest. I didn't need a podium. I stood center stage, back straight, lights not glaring but enough to see the faces below. I saw my mother in the 3rd row on the right. Her hair was whiter than before. She wore an old beige coat with a frayed collar. She kept her head bowed so low she barely dared to look up, but her shoulders trembled as she tried to steady her breath. To my left, a chair bore a nameplate: Emily Monroe, U.S. Federal Attorney. The seat was empty. My father stood at the back of the hall near the emergency exit. He did not sit. His hands were clenched, eyes fixed on me, unblinking. Not hate, not love, something else I have never been able to decode. I began, "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Chloe Monroe Gray." For much of my life, the name Monroe was what got me thrown out of the house, excluded from the dinner table, and removed from the list of birthday cards. The auditorium fell utterly silent. I didn't come here to tell a past. I came to propose a future. A future where people have the right to separate from toxic blood ties without being legally, politically, or emotionally harmed. I pulled a small packet of documents from my pocket and held it up carefully. This is the Draft Public Kinship Disclosure Act, a federal law designed to protect the privacy and dignity of citizens who are targeted by family members using past information. The act would prohibit anyone from using kinship information to threaten, discredit, or negatively affect a person's employment, legal record, or social standing. A murmur rippled from the back. I paused for a few seconds, then went on. I know that may sound strange, because we're taught that family is sacred. But tell me, since when is it sacred if it's the first place that makes you afraid of yourself? If your relatives are the first to deny your voice simply because you don't live the way they expect? I didn't look at my mother, but I could feel her crying, softly, silently. Her hands clenched the handkerchief in her lap. I went on. I'm not against the idea of family. I'm against family becoming an invisible shackle that robs an individual of self-determination. I'm against the same hands that lift you when you're small, turning into the hands that shove you off a cliff when you dare to be different. I paused. Cameras clicked. I scanned the room, my voice softened. You may not remember me after today, and that's okay. I don't need to be remembered. I just need not to be erased. Not because I'm governor. Because once I was a child with no bed to sleep in, cast out because my silence supposedly shamed the family. I set the packet down on the small table behind me, bowed my head, and left the stage in total silence. No one stood, no one applauded, but I didn't need applause. I needed something else. When I stepped out into the wings, a light rain had started. Fine threads of water dotted my hair, and coat not cold, but enough to sharpen the air. I didn't open an umbrella. I let the rain fall. I crossed the lawn toward the main plaza in front of the conference center when I heard small footsteps behind me. "Miss Monroe!" I turned. A little girl of about 8, with curly brown hair and round glasses, had run up to me. She held a small purple notebook. "Could you sign this for me?" she panted. I knelt and took the notebook. "What's your name?" "Lily," she whispered. I signed my name, not a title, not a political label, just the name I had once feared, now written calmly. Chloe Monroe Gray. I looked at her and smiled. "You have dreams too, don't you?" "I want to be a doctor," Lily murmured. "But my mother says I have to be good first to become a good person." I looked into her eyes. "You just have to be kind, not to please anyone, because this world needs people like you." I stood and handed the notebook back. Lily hugged it, then ran to her mother waiting a short distance away. I watched them go through the thin rain, and the sadness I'd carried felt lighter. What remained was a lightness, like wind, and something deeper than all of it, freedom. If you've ever felt you don't belong where you were born, if you've ever been hurt by your own family but dared not speak for fear of being called ungrateful, if you've ever lived needing to hide who you are, just to keep the peace at the dinner table, you are not alone. I'm not telling this story for pity or praise. I tell it because maybe, somewhere out there, someone is standing in the rain, carrying a stack of questions no one has ever listened to. What do you think of my story? Have you ever been in a similar situation or seen someone treated unfairly by their family just for living differently? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, because perhaps your story will give someone else the courage to move forward. And if you want to hear more true stories about family, about relationships that seem close but are full of challenges, about people like me who've fallen and chosen to rise, don't forget to follow the channel. We will keep telling these stories not to cling to the past, but to light the way for those who come after. Thank you for listening to my story. And if you're carrying a wound too, remember, no one is born to be erased.